We're looking at battery backup, putting them together with a battery backup system and kind of making it a in place of a fossil fuel powered generator, is because obviously we lose power a lot, and we're looking to augment or replace generators. So anyway, I will put my email in the chat if anybody wants to follow up. Thanks.
Hi, this is Dana Storr, San Mateo County Event Center and Fairgrounds. We have several resiliency projects moving forward. We have a Cal OES hazmat grant, which gives us additional generator backup. So the entire property will be backed up by generator. We're going to put in a solar RV area that will stage temporary housing in times of disaster. We are a designated resilient center. I recommend that just a resolution by the supervisors, which has helped us with the Strategic Growth Alliance grants. If no one knows about those are funds available to nonprofits. They've done their first round of funding. I can put my email in the chat as well for interesting, because they'll do a second round of funding. So there was 200 million that was pushed out initially. There's an anticipation of another 200 million. So that's available to community centers, nonprofits, and community organizations to improve their resiliency. So I will do that. And if anyone has any questions, I'm always available. Thank you.
I can jump in. Thanks, Dana and Irma. Those are great updates. These are just kind of ongoing services, but just want to make sure y'all are aware of it. So first of all, my name's Claire. I work with 211 in United Way Bay Area. So we just renewed our contract with PG&E, where we are continuing to offer care coordination for anyone that needs support in preparing for a power outage. And part of that also includes all disaster preparedness. So if folks call 211, we'll do a screening with them to find out if they're ready for a power outage, and then offer care coordination services. And so that includes things like a disaster plan. We also reach out to them if we know a power outage is coming. And then, of course, if power outage comes and we're not prepared, we also will text and call those callers and see how we can support. So especially interested, Irma, in your resources, because as part of that care coordination, we do connect folks to backup power resources, whether that's a portable generator or something else. So we will continue to do that at least for another year, hopefully more. And then as part of our Listos and earthquake preparedness projects, we're still promoting, you can text the word earthquake or terremoto to 211-211, and that just directs people to download the My Shake app and gives information. You don't have to share that, but if that's something helpful to you, you can absolutely use that. We'll be keeping that live for at least another year or two. And then as part of my work with VOADS in Solano and Marin, we've been tracking other cool Listos and disaster preparedness materials. And so I'll share out in this Google group, Catholic Charities in Solano, they made a loteria game around disaster preparedness with Listos funds that they're using with farm workers in Solano and Yolo counties. It's so cool. I just got to use it or play it last week. And so it's now ready to be shared out. So if that would be helpful to you or your partners, definitely check it out and see if you could use it. All right, thanks all.
Anyone else?
Sure, I'll bite. My name is Mark Dinan. I'm in East Palo Alto. We've been working hard for the last year or so to do a bunch of trainings in the community, along with Nuestra Casa and a few other local organizations. And so we had a final training, I think, about a week ago, Saturday. We've had about 200 people go through a 1-hour presentation put on by the Menlo Park Fire District and Michael Taylor presenting, and more people who have done like a 24-hour course. We're really far behind in terms of emergency preparedness in East Palo Alto. The community is not ready for any sort of a major event. And so we've been working with, trying to just, both establish a CERT group and get and recruit people into it, but also educate individuals and also work with organizations like Woodland Park Apartments, where tens of thousands of people in East Palo Alto live. But if there's an earthquake that hits, these are older buildings, they could collapse. And a lot of the folks there are low income and will not have water filters, emergency generators in their garage or anything like that. It just simply doesn't work. So we have a lot of challenges in East Palo Alto. The city hasn't put any money or energy into this in terms of emergency preparedness. And we're working with the city manager to try to get an emergency plan. The last time it was updated was, I think, 2002. So we're starting. We've got a lot of work ahead of us, but there's a lot of challenges ahead. But luckily, I think there's a lot of people from various groups trying to address it. It was a real wake-up call when we had power go out for 60 hours or 55 hours earlier this year. So,
Mark, are you working with Repact?
yes.
Okay.
Yeah, with Bob Jones and Repact. So we're doing that. That's the group that did all the trainings. I should have mentioned that. So, yeah.
And hi, everyone. Thank you, Mark, for sharing. Jennifer with Nuestra Casa. I also just wanted to amplify, at Nuestra Casa, we did a little bit about emergency preparedness in our Environmental Justice Academy, and we had one of our students do some workshops. I know that, with Repact now, they're actually also becoming a 501c3 nonprofit. So we're trying to now shift where we were thinking internally, what can we do as programs for emergency preparedness, but seeing how we can just support the work that they are doing and how we can collaborate together and making sure that the community is being able to attend those workshops. I know some people mentioned like certain times and then also language barriers. So we're going to work together, right, just to try to make sure that all our community in East Palo Alto can get those trainings, because we have heard a lot from other meetings that we've had on other projects that community resilience is a really big important thing right now. With like the Woodland apartments being flooded, community shared that, like, what can they do now to prepare themselves for the potential really rainy season that we're going to have. And they talked about like cleaning up the creek that flooded, right? Like, so ways that we can start building resilience and preparing ourselves, not just by like what items at home or in a building that we can get ready, but also to just in the area around us. And then also wanted to share that we do have noticias focused on disaster preparedness, focused not just like on flooding, right, but like earthquakes, and has a lot of just like the QR codes. It's in English and in Spanish. So if you have folks that you want to give information out like in Spanish, it's on our website. Anyone can feel free to use it. We kind of kept it pretty broad in general. Also, Robert Jones from Repact had put some information on there as well. So, happy to share that out onto the COAD group when it becomes live later today. I will put that on there. But yeah, I think it's just how can we work together and really amplify the work that other folks are already doing, and then just connect our communities to those groups. That way we're not reinventing the wheel and not having to basically do the same resources over and over again. So really want to see, Mark, how we can really just utilize what's there and work together to amplify that much needed work that needs to be done. So thank you.
Yeah, not to stay on the subject too long, but one of the huge issues we've had is language barrier. And there is I think November 11th, there is a Listos class coming up in Spanish, but we've had a lot of people show up and we haven't had translation, and due to resource constraints. We've also had people, there's a lot of Pacific Islanders, and there's been people from Tonga and Samoa showing up, and it's been a challenge. But we're at least making the effort. I don't think 5 years ago the effort was being made, so we're taking small steps in the right direction. And there's a lot of people working on it, so it's good stuff.
Yeah, Ron and then John. Hey, Ron, I think you're on mute.
Right, I am on mute. Yeah, I'm most interested. Actually, there's a frog in my throat or something. But I'm most interested in the period of time between the earthquake and 3 days after the earthquake, which is sort of a dead zone. It's 3 days after is when the state and county and federal people start to descend upon a damaged area. And I'm worried that people have water, power, light, and that their homes are safe in that period of time. I attended a Palo Alto session several years ago where I think the number one concern of people after an earthquake was their house safe. I'm actually also I'm from Foster City. I'm on the sustainability committee there, but I'm also on the Structural Engineers Association of Northern California's Disaster Emergency Services Committee, and they're the people that look at big structures and worry about those, bigger structures and the potential damage from that. They I've broached the subject. Well, what about small structures like homes? And I've got them interested in the possibility of trying to develop an approach to allow less authoritative type people, carpenters or people in the building trades, or even non-civil structural engineers, to perhaps have some very basic training in residential structures that could complement the other factors that the fire departments, et cetera, are trying to do after a disaster. In other words, provide a complementary service. So I'm going to be, they're at least interested in that, in a small buildings approach, and we'll see how that goes, how long I can maybe sustain the interest myself, but I think that a complement to the things that are traditionally done by the fire departments and first responders needs to be address the problem of is my home safe?
I think that's an excellent segue into our presentation, actually. Sarah Atkinson from SPUR is here. Sarah is the Earthquake Resilience Policy Manager. And this presentation is largely going to focus on structural mitigation. And I believe she's going to talk briefly about single family homes as well. So Sarah, would you like to start screen sharing?
Sure, yes. Hi, everyone. Let me just get my screen ready. Okay, is that good?
Looks good.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I'm really excited to be here. My name is Sarah Atkinson, Earthquake Resilience Policy Manager at SPUR. We're a nonprofit urban policy and planning organization based in San Francisco, but we work across the 9-county Bay Area. And I've been lucky to get to work with Anna and Thrive over the last about year on some projects in San Mateo County, and then also with Nuestra Casa on projects in East Palo Alto and some of the other Bayshore neighborhoods, more on groundwater and sea level rise. And nice to see Jennifer here. And yeah, it was really great to hear everyone's announcements and kind of how this space is being used to share resources. And I'm definitely going to be covering some of the things that you mentioned. So I appreciate the enthusiasm and the knowledge that's already in this space. So definitely like want that conversation to happen after this presentation and get some more chances to talk about what we can do next, especially on earthquake resilience. So yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about earthquake risk and exposure in San Mateo County, some of the priorities that I'm working on, specifically in San Mateo County, and then also beyond that, and then what this group and individual leaders of organizations in this group can do to reduce risk for yourself, your org, and the communities that you serve. So some things that could happen in the event of an earthquake. I think like Mark mentioned some things, Ron mentioned some things, but people could be killed or injured in the event of buildings collapsing or infrastructure collapsing. Our healthcare and emergency systems are potentially going to be really strained, and so it'll be hard to get to people if there's a lot of damage. Earthquakes trigger secondary hazards like liquefaction or landslides or even fires. That was a big thing in the 1906 fire. A lot of San Francisco burned. And this is a benefit of moving away from gas appliances and towards electrification is that opportunity for fire usually comes from gas leaks after an earthquake. So hopefully as we kind of move away from gas, we'll have less of that as a risk. Collapsed buildings also can mean loss of housing, which means that there's more need for temporary or permanent relocation. And that I'll jump down to my last one. Older buildings, which are the ones that are most at risk of collapsing, also contribute to what we call naturally occurring affordable housing. And if these buildings are lost, people are more likely to be displaced from their neighborhood and lose the community connections that they have, but then could be displaced from the region or even outside of that because of our housing crisis and the lack of affordable housing that we have. So there's a lot of there's like a lot of kind of like flowing issues that come from an earthquake. And there's a lot of things that we can do beyond just preparing for an earthquake and like the aftermath of an earthquake, but actually in the mitigation moment. And that's why Anna titled this Beyond Preparedness, like what can we do kind of before that so that the things that we have to respond to are maybe not as widespread. So I wanted to know, could people raise their hand if they have experienced an earthquake and if they experienced or if they experienced the 1989 earthquake? Okay. All right. Yeah, there's some people who've definitely experienced it, whether this earthquake or another earthquake. I will be honest and say I'm in this role, but I'm a little younger than 1989 and I did not experience the Loma Prieta earthquake. And I'm happy to say I've not experienced another major earthquake. But definitely it's being in this role, it definitely stresses me out. And when I first started, I had some bad dreams about earthquakes happening. So if you have experienced earthquakes, you probably know that it can be like a very scary experience, and at first you kind of don't really know what's happening. You don't know how big it's going to be, and you don't know what the extent of damages was after the earthquake happened. So if you don't know, in the Loma Prieta earthquake in 1989, the epicenter was in Santa Cruz County, so a little south of San Mateo, on the San Andreas Fault, which does run right through San Mateo. There were no deaths in this county, but 108 people were injured, 7 in the AmFac Hotel, which was near the airport. There was also damage at the Hall of Justice. There was a supermarket roof collapse, but a lot of the other damages were non-structural, so bookshelves falling over, computers falling off desks, windows breaking. And those are definitely things that can be more easily mitigated. But we're going to talk a little bit more about kind of like the bigger picture of like buildings and structural safety right now. Actually, after this. So 1989, a lot of people feel like, okay, that was a big earthquake, but there wasn't that much damage. There wasn't like widespread injury or death. Why should I worry so much about this? My building is still standing. It was built before 1989. So first, the epicenter was located a little farther away. It was not located on the part of the fault that actually runs through the county. So if there was an earthquake on that part of the fault, damage would be more widespread, even at a 6.9 magnitude earthquake. Also, this earthquake was relatively small. For example, in Turkey, the earthquakes that happened in February, those were 7.9, and then within 24 hours, a 7.5 earthquake followed. And a 7.9 earthquake compared to a 6.9 earthquake is 32 times larger. So there could be a lot more damage in the event of a much larger earthquake. USGS engineers and researchers have also published that there's a 21% chance of a magnitude 6.7 or greater earthquake occurring on this section of the San Andreas Fault before 2036. So we kind of like know that it is coming, potentially it could be coming soon. We don't know when. There's a nexus with sea level rise and groundwater rise. This is something that we've been talking about with Nuestra Casa and how that overlaps with liquefaction risk. So liquefaction is when the ground turns into like a liquid, and building foundations can sink into the ground, cars can sink into the ground. I should have added one of the photos. It's pretty wild to see. But as the ground, especially along the bayshore, is more saturated, more area is going to be at higher risk of liquefaction. And then existing buildings built before the 1989 earthquake, they're now even older. They have probably not had the maintenance that they needed to have in this time. They might have mold in the walls that leads to structural instabilities. And so they're just at higher risk of collapse. And then, yeah, this is just an image of liquefaction risk along San Mateo County's bayshore. And there's also a lot of areas along the bayshore that have artificial fill, and artificial fill, the way that we did artificial fill before we kind of understood a lot of these earthquake risks was we didn't compact it enough. And so it's much more likely to liquefy in an earthquake. Okay, so some buildings that we want to be aware of. Raise your hand if you recognize any of these buildings from your community or the community you work in. If you've seen any of these, okay. John's seen some, Jennifer's seen some. Yeah, Mark. Yeah, so well, one of these buildings, this single family living space over garage, I got this picture off of Google Maps in East Palo Alto. So there's a lot of these buildings in San Mateo County. Another building type that's really common is single family cripple wall. So where if you like are walking into a home and you're going up a small set of stairs, you probably are in a cripple wall single family home. The building that I want to focus on right now is actually these concrete tilt-up buildings. These are often big box stores, supermarkets. They can be auto repair shops, and they have been created by lifting concrete walls and then attaching them together. But the way that they were attached leaves them susceptible to walls like falling out, which can cause roof collapses. And this is really a big issue because in the event of an earthquake, if supermarkets become unusable because the building has partially collapsed, people won't be able to get food, and it'll be harder to provide that service to people. And then the city will have to kind of figure out how to fill in that service. And then unreinforced masonry buildings. In the 90s, the state passed a law that cities had to create inventories of these buildings. So every city in the state knows how many of these buildings that they have. Some cities move forward with mandatory ordinances to retrofit these buildings. Some didn't. There definitely still are some of these buildings around that have not been retrofitted, but I would say that many have. If you work in one of these buildings or know one of these buildings in your community, you should ask the city if it's been retrofitted as a way to kind of like push them forward if they haven't done it. So two other high-risk building types. I'll start with the non-ductile concrete building. There's estimated 240 pre-1980 concrete buildings in Burlingame, and this was from a study by the UC Berkeley PUR, which is the Earthquake Engineering Research Center. I forget what the Pacific Earthquake Engineering Research Center. And these buildings are in earthquakes around the world have been known to basically go through like complete collapse if they were built at a certain period of time and have certain structural deficiencies. And for example, in the New Zealand earthquake in 2011, 116 people died in one of these buildings when it collapsed because the entire building collapsed, and it was a media, like news media center. So there were a lot of people in it at the time, and the earthquake happened in the middle of the day. So these are like very high risk, very cause a lot of issues with life safety. They're also expensive to retrofit. And so there's a lot of challenges with kind of requiring these retrofits. And the city of San Francisco right now is actually going through a process to try to pass an ordinance to get these buildings retrofitted. So we'll see what happens with that. I'm going to move to these wood frame soft story buildings. These are also super common. These pictures are both from going around San Mateo County on Google Maps and finding some of these buildings. So they're really common. They are usually apartments over a garage space, and the garage space has been under reinforced. So in an earthquake, it will kind of like go like that. And these are less of an issue in terms of life safety because actually the rest of the structure tends to remain and people are able to leave the building. But if people are in their car on the first floor, or, you know, there are ways that people could get seriously injured in the collapse of these buildings. But even more than that, these are housing, and these are multifamily housing, and they're often what I mentioned as naturally occurring affordable housing. And so the loss of these buildings is really what contributes to displacement in communities and just lack of access, continued lack of access to housing. Anna and I, mostly Anna coordinated this, but I got to do some work with some students at Stanford as well. And this is an image that they put together for us as a heat map of where these buildings could be located in San Mateo County. And the way that they did some of their methods, it doesn't quite show the exact subset of buildings that we want to be looking at, but it's good for comparing different cities. So from this, we can see Daly City, South San Francisco, Burlingame, and Redwood City are likely the cities that have the highest concentration of these buildings. And those are cities along with actually East Palo Alto, where we're trying to push a retrofit ordinance or studies or some sort of inventory so we can start to get to move on retrofitting these buildings. Also, if at any moment you want to ask a quick clarifying question, feel free to drop it in the chat or come off mute, and I'll feel free to answer it. But we'll also have some time afterwards for questions as well. And I'm sorry if I'm going quickly. Yes, Q. Do you have a question?
Thank you for the opportunity. Q Smith, East Palo Alto Planning Commissioner and community activist. You just mentioned East Palo Alto working with you to create a retrofit ordinance. Will that cost come through county, state, city, or the homeowner?
Yeah, that's a great question. I actually took that slide out of this, but that is a really good question. We are trying to work with the city to find a way to have the costs spread across all those different stakeholders, but really leaning heavily on some funding that is from the federal government, from FEMA. And then also there was a state, there was a funding package passed for a program for retrofitting multifamily soft story housing this past year, $15 million. And the California Earthquake Authority is going to be implementing that program over the next year. And so we're hoping that some of that funding can be used, especially for the buildings in these cities that house the lowest income residents. hopefully that answers your question.
Yes.
Yeah. Great. Jennifer?
Yeah, so I had a question, Sarah, when you were talking about a lot of those buildings that, have like parking as the first level and then, the apartments above them. I just started then thinking about a lot of the new development that's happening now, and especially a lot of that is happening like in North Fair Oaks, and the parking structure is underground. And I know they've retrofitted it right for earthquakes, but with the concern now of like liquefaction, and I know like North Fair Oaks, a lot of times they flood as well. What is the likelihood of those types of building, especially if like they get approved like in East Palo Alto? Like what effect is that, and are people thinking about that when they're developing like new housing?
Yeah, that is a great question. I'm gonna put that on hold because I have a slide about that, and I'll answer the rest of that question in a second. But yes, really good questions, and yeah, definitely keep raising your hands because it's good for me to make sure I'm like touching everything you all want to hear about. So just to finish this section, so there was a structural engineer, David Bonowitz, that I work with, who has been working with cities on ordinance development. And he looked at a bunch of different cities and did studies for them on the number of soft story buildings that they have. And he found that there's on average 5 to 15% of the housing stock in these different cities is soft story buildings in need of retrofitting. And these are, I think I didn't say this as well earlier, but these are buildings that are generally built before the 1980s. The 1980s, early 80s was when the Universal Building Code passed, which had a lot of structural improvements for buildings, especially around earthquake safety. And he also then looked at multifamily housing stock and the percentage of these buildings that make up multifamily housing stock in these cities, and it was between 20 and 40%. So that's, multifamily housing stock is where the majority of people are in a lot of cities. And so that is really the percentage that we want to be thinking about, and that these are really contributing to, to housing in all these cities. And this is probably very likely the comparable in San Mateo County, that there's about 20 to 40% of multifamily housing stock as soft story that needs retrofitting. And by extending that outward, if there is an earthquake, these buildings could be vulnerable to collapse. So Jennifer, getting to your question, so new buildings, a lot of people think, okay, my building is new, it was built after 89, it was built after the Universal Building Code, and it must be safe for me. And I would say, yes, it is safe, but these buildings are built to life safety standards. So you should not die in your new building. But that doesn't mean you couldn't be injured by non-structural things within the building, which aren't thought about as much. And then also these types of buildings can have collapse or can have partial collapses or other like structural issues, like the structure can shake and crack, and that could mean that you can't go into your building for 6 months or something while it's being repaired. And there are a lot of opportunities for improving these new buildings and building to higher safety standards, so that there is a functional recovery element, so that people can return home or return to use of these buildings. And there's an effort right now at the federal level to implement these new building codes, but it's definitely a long process. And there's a lot of interest to not have this happen, because it does add a tiny bit of extra cost, and especially around housing, we already struggle with building housing, especially in the Bay Area. And then Jennifer, to extend that question, when you asked about flooding and kind of the issues with liquefaction, a lot of newer buildings really are taking that into consideration, and especially with ground floor garage space, they're doing that sort of on purpose so that it can be a space that like could have flooding, but isn't going to impact people's, the actual living space. And they might have pumps. And there also is more considerations now around liquefaction safety and trying to build the foundations deeper to the bedrock. In some places in the Bay Area, that's more available than others because bedrock is really deep. And there are considerations in the building code for how you're supposed to manage liquefaction safety, but it's not, again, as high as we'd like it to be. Yes, Ron. Oh, you're on mute.
Yeah, just going back to your soft story studies, who is doing that, and what is the result of it?
Wow, I'm going the wrong direction. Yes, so this slide.
No, the next one.
Oh, the next one. Okay, yes. So David Bonowitz did this study, and he's using these numbers to, and is giving me these numbers to help encourage cities to develop ordinances. But that's kind of as far as we can go right now. It would be great. We're also using these at the state level to show how much funding is going to be needed to retrofit these buildings, and why it's such an important part of mitigation.
So I could reach out to David Bonowitz. I do know him. So
Yeah, definitely.
If Foster City is not listed on it, but we're relatively new, so we may not have some of the same problems the older cities have.
Yeah, I know that these were ones that he was actually a consultant for these cities to do studies. So these are like real numbers that he, did research on. And some city, obviously a lot of cities haven't gone through this process yet. Yes, Dana.
Hi, Sarah, thank you. Yeah, Dina Gunning, Central County Fire. We're working on, we have an ad hoc committee for Burlingame right now, because I noticed Burlingame seemed to be that hot spot with that slide that you had. So we're well aware of that. And as emergency management through the fire department and the jurisdictions, we're working together so that we have that list of those soft story buildings, because most likely that's going to be where we're going to need to put the resources for search and rescue, because they're going to have the highest damage and the highest impacts. I also wanted to mention it's really important for people to look at their insurance on a regular annual basis. There's United policyholders, and I'll grab the web link and drop it in the chat for folks. No matter if you're a renter or an owner, you really need to assess your insurance, because there's two sides of it. There's all the contents, which, you want to have special insurance if you have collectibles or things like that you need to have underwritten that aren't part of the policy. But then your structural side, right? And making sure that you have those clauses that will include if you have complete structural damage or you can no longer occupy your home or apartment or condominium, that you have that underwritten, that you will be able to stay in a hotel or, not be in a shelter. You can have those clauses also put into your insurance policies. So I highly recommend that people take a look at that. But thank you, Anna and Sarah, for doing this. It's the awareness, and it's doing all those things in your own home. And whether or not you live in a really new retrofitted building or not, your contents within are going to move. So it's really important to strap those things down, secure the bigger items, and just know where your hot spots are, the kitchen and other places where you have a lot of broken glass and things like that can cause injury. So the secondary issue also for us is broken gas lines and fire. We always recommend, making sure you have working extinguishers and things like that. But, knowing all those factors and doing the assessment is just really important. So thank you guys. I appreciate the session.
Yeah, thank you, Dina. Yeah, that is a great point. And I'll just add, I didn't have this in my slides, but I know that FEMA is right now developing a resource for renters around earthquake insurance. And if you are getting renters insurance, that there's a way to make sure that your renters insurance includes earthquakes. So that's another resource that once that's ready, I can definitely share it out with the group as well. All right, so moving through, I'll go really quickly, but SPUR has had, the organization I work for has had a long history of working on earthquake resilience. We actually got started after the 1906 earthquake and thinking about the rebuilding of San Francisco. And in the last 15 or 20 years, we've really expanded regionally, and now I've been doing a lot more of this work on a regional scale. And we have some great reports if it's interesting to any of you. We did a whole set on the resilient city where we talk about building it right the first time. So resilience for new buildings, retrofitting existing buildings. We also talk about resilient hubs, community resilience hubs. I saw that mentioned in the chat a couple times, and kind of what those mean and the value of those hubs. And I believe there's some case studies in there too, if that's interesting. And then in, I think, 2021, we did this report, Safety First, Improving Hazard Resilience in the Bay Area. And we have some recommendations laid out in there of what we want to see the Bay Area move on in terms of hazard resilience. So these are resources for you. I can, after this, drop them in the chat as well. But we're kind of like moving forward from that work and trying to do some more, taking the research and recommendations that we did for these reports and now actually trying to get them into the cities and counties that we work with. So some of the things that I'm focused on in my work is, as I've sort of mentioned, improving the seismic safety of new and existing buildings through research and advocacy. And I'm focusing on local retrofit mandates. So if that's something that is interesting to you in the city you live in and work in, let me know. And I would love to partner with you on that. It's much easier to have someone that's excited that is in those areas. I live in Oakland, so I don't live in San Mateo County, but I definitely enjoy partnering with people in San Mateo County. Looking for state and federal funding and trying to reduce the barriers to accessing that funding for cities and for property owners as well. Building it right the first time, kind of talked about that, the building code updates. And then secondarily, kind of making this connection between earthquake and climate resilience and how we need to be preparing for all of these things at the same time. And there are, there's a lot of cost incurred in adapting to climate change. And there's also costs in managing earthquakes and making sure that we are safe. And so trying to figure out kind of the balance of those two things is really important. So far, Anna and I have spoken with representatives in Redwood City, East Palo Alto, Burlingame, the city of San Mateo, and San Mateo County Supervisor. And we've gotten a lot of support for this, but definitely, I think Q asked the question about cost. That is definitely a big barrier, and kind of the first question that comes up is who's going to pay for this. And that is definitely what I am trying to work on, is making sure that this is accessible to communities and that there are financial resources to make sure these retrofits can happen, and that there's not undue stress on renters in the process of retrofitting as well. Our goal is that at least three more cities in the Bay Area adopt mandatory retrofit ordinances by 2027. And I'm really focused on the soft story retrofits, but also concrete, non-ductile concrete, tilt-up concrete, and these other at-risk building types are ones that we're trying to move forward as well. And I'll just make another plug about the connection between earthquakes and climate. So following the 2010 and 2011 earthquakes in New Zealand, about 9 million tons of waste was generated, which was about 40 years of the waste they normally send to the landfill. And they had to create a couple new landfills. And so in terms of like our climate goals at a state, at a national, at a worldwide level, reducing earthquake damage and the waste that's produced, especially from buildings collapsing or infrastructure collapsing, is really beneficial to continuing on our climate journey. Okay, so let's see, I have 10 minutes left, but I'm going to do this in like 2 minutes so we can have some more conversation. So what can you do to reduce earthquake vulnerability in your community? Definitely continue to strategize for how to prepare your organization and those you serve. And I push you to think broader than just like that preparedness, like post-earthquake response piece, but also, mitigation and how can you support, for example, retrofit ordinances, or even just assessments of buildings that serve community members in your neighborhood that really need to be functional after an earthquake happens so that people can access resources. Drive community-led knowledge and action. I think that's one of the things I've had the hardest time in this work. It's been great working with Anna and having her work with me to kind of like push this effort forward in San Mateo County. We would love to see more community groups interested in earthquake resilience. Obviously, it's probably like the 10th, maybe 20th thing in the list of like priorities. There's housing issues, there's access to food, there's all of these things. And if there's a way for you to incorporate this in kind of those initial like high level priorities, I would love to be a resource for you in thinking through how to do that and different ways that you can engage. Advocating for more action on earthquake resilience and mitigating these hazards. I will continue to be sending out resources through kind of the Google group and to this group, and there's opportunities to come to city council meetings or board supervisor meetings, or even sign letters to the state about funding. So like, if you can, it would be great if you can participate in some of those efforts. And if you are interested in leading or, you know, being a voice in those efforts, definitely reach out to me. And then finally, securing your space. This is kind of outside of the realm of things that I was talking about today, but securing your space and securing the space of the people you serve can be really helpful in terms of minimizing injury in earthquake. And I just shout out to Thrive for getting a grant this past year and completing retrofits for 8, I think, nonprofit like office spaces in San Mateo County. And this was a pilot program. We would love to be able to do this more and are definitely keeping our eyes out for funding. And yeah, I hope, I would love to participate in this more. And I think someone else mentioned like training. There was definitely knowing how to do these types of securing your space projects is difficult. And if we could have a space where we could train people to do it and then spread that out to the community in a much more like strategic fashion, I think that would be awesome. And on the broader scale of like housing improvements, I think that there does need to be a lot more training for contractors and how to do these retrofits, and so that we can get them done faster and cheaper too. Yeah, I think that's everything from me. I hope this was interesting to you. I hope this was helpful and there was some new information. And if you have any questions, I'm here. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. I think we had a few questions in the chat, but for those that didn't feel their question was fully answered, please go ahead and come off mute now. Sarah, go ahead.
How do I contact you?
Yes. Let me put my email in the chat. There you go. Feel free to send me an email. I would love to connect.
Sarah, can you talk through some of the financing options for retrofit? We talked briefly about the state and federal funding, but there are several other financing strategies that we've seen other cities in the Bay Area use. Did you want to just give like a 2-minute overview of those?
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, there's a number of, I'll go through, for example, San Francisco had created a program or a partnership with PACE Financing, Property Assessed Clean Energy, so you can get tax rebates through that process for your retrofit. There's also San Francisco also worked with private banks to do low interest loans for retrofits. Oakland, Berkeley, and San Jose applied for hazard mitigation funds for their programs. So people can then apply for grants to do their retrofits, and those grants generally covered about 75% of the construction cost. And actually, I should start and say, for soft story retrofits, these are actually the cheapest. One of the cheapest. Actually, tilt up, I think, is cheaper than soft story retrofitting. But these generally cost for a building between $100,000 and $200,000, which is a lot of money, but in the in terms of like the renovations that get done on buildings, it's actually a much lower cost and kind of easy for some to make happen. Yeah, I'm trying to think if I'm forgetting anything. Oh, I did mention the California Earthquake Authority. They have grants for the cripple wall. You can get a $3,000 grant from them to do a retrofit of your single family cripple wall home. They also just launched a program to get retrofit funding. I think it's $13,000 for single family living space over garage buildings. So I think one thing is they've been really focused on single family retrofit grants. And now with this multifamily soft story program, they will be actually doing retrofits that are going to support renters, which is really great to see. But it's the first time that they're doing that, which is kind of wild considering how many people are renters. Yeah, Jennifer.
Yeah, I had a question and then an ask. So my first question was, how do you potentially, like, if you say rent an apartment and you know that there's issues with your building and have had issues even just like with flooding, is there any legal way to try to push a property manager or an owner to say, hey, us as a community want to see this retrofitting happening, especially if funding can come from another place? I think that's a lot of times what communities have seen from what I've heard, that sometimes property managers or owners like to do the bare minimum, even if there's potential funding available.
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say on the flooding side, I think there's a lot more options because there's a lot more arguments that can be made about health and safety, and the property owner not having a healthy building for people to live in. In terms, and maybe some other people on this call might have some answers to this too. On the seismic side, it's really hard you don't really have any like legal recourse unless there is a mandate from the city, which is why it's great to get cities to pass mandates. But I think also having a community come together and say, like, these buildings are unsafe. Our city we don't have any way to like require these buildings to retrofit. And you go to the city and say, this is something we care about. I think that really pushes the needle in making change on these issues.
Thank you. And I think that ties nicely what was going to be my ask. I think a lot of this is conversations that community members and other organizations are bringing up. And I'm not sure if you have the capacity, or maybe Anna, to come and talk a little bit about this at the climate change community team meetings that happen. It would need to be coordinated with CRC, but I think it would be a really great place to kind of talk a little bit about this more to community members themselves and also the nonprofits that are serving them. So I'm not sure capacity, but I would personally love to see this in one of those meetings.
Yeah, that sounds great. I would love to. Mark?
Yeah, hi. Great presentation, very interesting subject matter. How much roughly does a retrofit cost for an apartment building? Let's say you have a 20-unit apartment building. Is there any ballpark figure per unit how much retrofitting costs?
That is a great question, and something I've been doing a lot of research on, and will be releasing a research brief on in the next couple months. It's hard to say a number per unit because it really depends on, it varies across the number of units. So like 5-unit buildings the majority of buildings cost between like $50,000 and $150,000. buildings that are like 10 and over can cost usually between like 150 and 250,000. So I would say the range is like 50 to 250,000. Majority of buildings are between 100 and 200,000. And then there are some buildings that will cost more than that, usually because they have to replace the foundation for various reasons. But those are a much smaller percentage of buildings.
Yeah, I mean, it gets complicated in East Palo Alto with these very old buildings that, as you mentioned, are naturally affordable because they are rent controlled. And oftentimes there's very little income coming in. And so if you were to tell a property owner, well, you've got to spend $250,000 or more retrofitting your building, they may say, well, where's the money coming from? Because we're not making a profit. And so this is just a huge expense. So the other issue in East Palo Alto is, I know that a lot of the older buildings, the owners would like to redevelop them. So instead of saying, well, retrofit, and say, how about we knock them down and put something up in its place? And you have a lot of community resistance to development, like you see in every other community here. So it's a little bit more complicated than because there's really no point in retrofitting a building from 1920 that has black mold and all these other issues when you have a developer willing to build on that site. But it gets more complicated. But anyway, thank you for your answer. It's very helpful.
Yeah, no, those are great points. And I think that's why this state funding program, I submitted recommendations because they're in the process of developing this program to really target those rent controlled multifamily buildings, since that's where like it's going to be hard for property owners to do it. And also we don't want 100% of those costs to be passed on to the rent controlled tenants too. And there's ways to make sure that that doesn't happen. But also if the state is providing funding, then that cost can't be passed on to the tenants. But the redevelopment question is really hard. And I think there's, I'm forgetting the name of this group, but there's also some efforts to provide more funding to groups that are buying these properties and rehabilitating them, but keeping them as affordable. And I'm hoping to see more investment in those groups in the near future. Dina, and also I know it's past time. I'm happy to stay on if people want to jump off. I will not be offended.
Thanks, Sarah. I dropped the link for the Brace and Bolt program in the chat for folks because they're basically the match with the $3,000, and it's about between $5,000 and $10,000 depending on your home and what needs to be retrofitted. If you do have like the soft story garage and whatnot, I have a property like that too, where we had to cripple some walls on one side, basement side. So there's just varying aspects to it. But again, just checking in. Find one of your elected officials that you can connect with on this, because trying to push an ordinance through, we're finally to that point. It's on the council agenda for our November 6th meeting for Burlingame. So I sit on that ad hoc committee, and we've been working for probably about 1.5 years on it. We're finally to that point. The other good thing is, connect with Sarah, find out what other jurisdictions are similar to yours that already have ordinances. I think we've been looking at some of the smaller cities like Mill Valley and such that have already put ordinances through. I worked on the Oakland one for years when I was over at Oakland Fire. So it takes time, but you got to find the right people to help you push it through. And again, find one of those electeds that's passionate about it, that maybe sits on your building committee or one of your other commissions, maybe even your emergency services council rep, because we all have one of those that sit on our emergency services council as well. And that's really what it takes to get it pushed through. But just doing that soft story assessment in your jurisdiction allows us, again, to strategize for recovery and things like that. And we have to remember that we work on the other side of the fence with all this too, with the general plan, our safety elements and our housing elements. They all have to connect. So that's another area just to be sure your jurisdiction, your city or town is tying that into, because that's where you can connect all those different plans and really make it work and look at that recovery. If you don't have that, when you have recovery reimbursement dollars coming back from FEMA or the state, they take a look at that. They want to know what that recovery and redevelopment plan is and how did you link it with those other elements of your general plan. So it's a lot of work on the back end, but you got to just find those key people that can help you and, you know, get it off the ground.
Yeah, thank you, Dina. Those are great comments. And one of the things that I've been working on with this is commenting on safety elements and local hazard mitigation plans in their draft stage. And we were actually able to get Oakland to commit to looking into a non-ductile and tilt-up concrete ordinance, or at least like doing an assessment in the safety element that they just adopted. So making comments really does help, and it really does get cities to move forward on these things. And if you don't have the capacity to make those comments and you just know that your city is developing a safety element or a local hazard mitigation plan, let me know and I will happily send them a letter.
I think that's where we're fortunate in our county. We just completed ours, I don't know, 2 years. We do these plans every 5 years, and by the time they're finished and all implemented and you blink, you're having to do the revisions. So it's a constant, but that's your opportunity to make those improvements and get those things into the plans. So you raise the awareness of your electeds as well. And a lot of them know, but yeah, hit that emergency services council rep. They're the person that is directly connected to all that information.
Yeah. Yeah. Josue?
Yes, thank you. Crowded spaces, like for example, we do work with day laborers, and they are renting in houses or properties that there is, it's like part of what we conceptualize as being homeless, because there is 2-3 people or even more living in renting in and living in a living room besides the bedrooms that there might be that are also overcrowded. And the landlords, if they need to do a simple renovation or like retrofitting, then the laborers are asked to leave, and when they try to come back, then the rent price has gotten up, and so it's not longer affordable for them. So that's one of the situations, and there is even like people converting their garages into bedrooms, and it's also overcrowded, and that situation increases the risks. So that's one thing. And I just also wanted to share that I experienced an earthquake 7.5 in my home country when I was just becoming a teenager. And I do remember one of the first things that goes out is, power outages, water pipelines broken. And so the structural damages are the more visible things, and also the loss of lives. And then for those who survived trauma, well, at the moment of an earthquake, like all the anxiety, panic, and heart attacks. So there is also a need for prepare in that direction as well, besides, of course, the structural aspect of the whole thing. And then food scarcity and or availability of food and water. And given the number of deaths that took place at that event, diseases that are spread out very quickly because there is now time for sanitation and a way that it's fast enough. So those things that also need to be considered in as part of the preparedness, which you are, like I said, already making us think about and also get ready for it. And I think that will make a big difference in the event of an earthquake. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for sharing that and your experiences in another earthquake. I think I should say, like, this is really focused, this presentation was definitely really focused on like structural hazards and mitigating those. And there's so much more. Like San Francisco has a Lifelines Council that's really talking about, loss of water, loss of power, and how to mitigate those and reduce the time that it takes to get those services back. And if there isn't something like that in San Mateo County, I think that would be a great thing to like bring utilities and bring the emergency managers and everything together to make sure that there's that kind of coordination. But yeah, there's so much more beyond just the structural, and also definitely just the challenge around like losing your community and losing a space that was important to you and was home. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. Okay, I'm gonna take these last two and then I'm gonna let everyone go. Francisco? You're on mute.
No, I know, and then it's not really a question, but just a more additional reflection, and then I can be quiet. And I apologize for being so late. But just also echoing and saying thank you for sharing that. So I'm Frankie from the Pride Center. For those who don't know, our services are focused on mental health and substance use support, and just the mental health aspect, just bringing it wholly and full circle. And also not just for adults also, but just my mind went to kids, and just also trying to be present just for service providers and humans in that moment, and trying to explain everything that's happening, and just trying to like zoom out on everything. And again, I know your presentation was very focused and needed. And for all of us in this work, as we're trying to prepare and be reactive and be proactive, I know some of the workshops that we've developed to be a part of are also not just in that moment, but trying to go backwards, right, and examine and re-examine. Then we're also developed curriculum that's aimed at gearing towards how do we help little ones understand contextually. And so it's like we have to think of, it's so hard, there's so much to think about. And so I just wanted to also add that element. There's language differences and development differences, and it's just so much. And so this group is really like, we have to remember, and it's just important to name all of these things, because we might not all be thinking of all these perspectives. And so I just wanted to thank everyone for that.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. I appreciate it. And great, it sounds like you're doing great work. Okay, I think any last things? I think we're good.
Thank you, Sarah, so much for the presentation. I think Sarah's dropped her email in the chat. We're also going to be sending out an email with the slides and with the recording and with contact information for Sarah. So look out for that later today, as well as the Google group invite. Right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.